The desert felt off. Not empty. Not peaceful. Just watching. A dry wind swept across the gas station, carrying dust in slow spirals across the concrete. The sound of engines broke the silence. Low, aggressive, approaching fast. 7 bikers. Loud. Confident. Unapologetic. They rolled in like they owned the place, surrounding the pumps, their laughter cutting through the air. People nearby glanced once, then looked away. Because scenes like this rarely end quietly. And then, it happened. A sharp movement. A sudden shove. A woman stumbled back, caught off guard, her expression shifting from confusion to shock. The laughter that followed made it worse. Not just what happened, but how easily it was dismissed. Ignored. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Except, there was one man who didn't move. Not out of fear, but out of control. Steven Seagal stood a few steps away, still as stone. Black leather jacket. Gloves. Dark sunglasses. Unbothered on the outside. But watching everything. Carefully. He didn't rush in. Didn't react emotionally. Didn't try to draw attention. That's what made it different. Because most people react first, and think later. He did the opposite. The leader of the bikers noticed him almost instantly. A man not flinching, not avoiding eye contact, not playing along with the tension. That stood out. The leader smirked, nudging one of his men before stepping forward slightly. "Well, look at that," he muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Someone thinks he's brave." More laughter followed. But it didn't land the same way. Because the man they were mocking wasn't reacting. At all. No anger. No fear. No hesitation. Just silence. And something about that silence felt heavier than the noise. The wind picked up again, brushing past his jacket as he slowly lifted his head. Not aggressively. Not dramatically. Just enough to show he was aware. Fully aware. And in that moment, something shifted. Not outside. Inside the circle. Because confidence built on numbers is loud. But real control? It's quiet. And dangerous in a completely different way. The engine slowly went quiet, but the tension didn't. It lingered in the air, thick, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. Steven Seagal hadn't come here for anything unusual. Just a brief stop. Fuel. A moment of stillness before continuing down an empty stretch of road. That was the plan. But moments like this don't follow plans. They interrupt them. The woman stepped back, trying to steady herself, her eyes scanning the area as if expecting someone, anyone, to step in. But people kept their distance. Some pretended not to notice. Others watched just enough to understand, then looked away. Because getting involved carries risk. And most people avoid risk when it isn't theirs. The bikers, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. Laughing. Relaxed. Unchallenged. To them, this wasn't a situation. It was entertainment. The leader rolled his shoulders, glancing back at his group before locking eyes with Steven again. There was a certain arrogance in his expression, the kind that comes from never being questioned. "You still here?" he said, tilting his head slightly. "Thought you'd walk away by now." Steven didn't answer. Not because he didn't hear, but because he didn't need to. Instead, he shifted his attention briefly, not toward the leader but toward everything else. The positioning of each biker. The distance between them. Their posture. Their energy. Who was leading? Who was following? Who was confident? And who was just pretending? It all registered in seconds. Because real awareness isn't loud. It's precise. One of the bikers kicked lightly at the gravel near Steven's boots, testing for a reaction. Another circled slightly, trying to close space, trying to provoke something, anything. Still nothing. No sudden movement. No defensive stance. Just stillness. And that stillness began to feel deliberate. The kind that doesn't come from uncertainty, but from control. The leader's smirk faded just a fraction. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough to matter. "Let me guess," he continued, voice sharper now. "You think you're different?" Pause. The wind passed through again, tugging lightly at Steven's jacket. Slowly, he adjusted his gloves. Not aggressively. Not nervously. But with intention. A small movement. Yet it carried weight. Because it showed readiness without announcing it. Years of discipline lived in that single gesture. Not for show. Not for intimidation. But as a habit. A mindset. The bikers exchanged brief glances. Something unspoken passed between them. Doubt. It wasn't strong yet. But it was there. Because people who rely on noise and numbers aren't used to facing silence that doesn't break. The leader took one step closer. Close enough now to test boundaries. Close enough to expect a reaction. "You got something to say," he muttered, lowering his voice, "or are you just gonna stand there?" Steven finally looked directly at him. Not with anger. Not with fear. But with clarity. And that was enough to shift the moment again. Because eye contact, when it carries no hesitation, feels different. It removes the illusion of control. It forces reality into the situation. For the first time since they arrived, the leader wasn't completely certain. And uncertainty is where tension truly begins. The space between them grew tighter. Not physically, but mentally. The kind of tension you can't measure, only feel. Steven Seagal stood exactly where he was, unchanged, unmoved. But everything around him felt different now. The laughter had faded. Not completely, but enough to notice. One of the bikers let out a forced chuckle, glancing at the others as if trying to bring the energy back. "Man, this guy thinks he's something," he said. Another stepped forward, slower this time. Less confident. He stopped just short of Steven, testing the space between them. Close enough to provoke. Close enough to expect some kind of reaction. Still nothing. No flinch. No step back. No raised voice. Just presence. And that presence was starting to press back. The biker hesitated for half a second. Barely visible, but real. He shifted his weight, looking over his shoulder toward the leader, silently asking for reassurance. The leader noticed. And he didn't like it. Because hesitation spreads. And once it starts, it's hard to stop. "Say something," the leader snapped louder this time. "Or is that your whole act?" A few of the others laughed again, but it sounded different now. Less natural. Less certain. Because something wasn't lining up. They had numbers. They had control. They had the advantage. So why did it feel like they didn't? Steven slowly turned his head, letting his gaze move across each of them. Not quickly. Not nervously. But deliberately. One by one. As if he had already figured something out, and was just confirming it. That kind of attention makes people uncomfortable. Because it feels like being understood, without saying a word. One biker looked away first. Then another. Small cracks. But cracks nonetheless. The wind picked up again, louder now, brushing dust across the ground between them. The sound filled the silence just enough to make the moment stretch. Longer. Heavier. The leader stepped closer again, this time invading the space more directly. "You think staring changes something?" he said quietly. Steven didn't respond with words. But his posture shifted just slightly. Not into aggression. Not into defense. But into readiness. Balanced. Grounded. Controlled. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't even notice it. But they did. Because when you're looking for weakness, you notice strength. And suddenly, this didn't feel like an easy situation anymore. One of the bikers exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Another adjusted his stance, no longer as relaxed as before. Their confidence had been loud. But it wasn't stable. And now it was being tested. Not by force. But by something harder to deal with. Certainty. The leader tried to push through it. Tried to regain control of the moment. He smirked again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. "You're real quiet for someone surrounded," he said. That word hung in the air. Surrounded. It was meant to remind. To reassert dominance. To bring things back to how they were just minutes ago. But it didn't land the same way anymore. Because now, they were aware of something they hadn't considered before. Being surrounded doesn't always mean being in control. Steven's expression didn't change. But the message was clear without a single word. He wasn't reacting. Because he didn't need to. And that realization hit harder than any action could have. Backhand index pointing right. Have you ever seen a situation change without anything actually happening? The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. Not the kind of silence that fades. The kind that forces people to think. Steven Seagal finally moved. Not suddenly. Not aggressively. But with purpose. One step forward. That was all it took. No rush. No tension in his shoulders. No sign of panic. Just a controlled shift in position. Subtle but undeniable. And somehow, that single step carried more weight than everything the bikers had done so far. The leader noticed it immediately. His expression tightened just for a moment. Because something changed in that step. It wasn't a reaction. It was a decision. And decisions, especially calm, confident ones, are hard to challenge. Enough. The word was quiet. But it didn't need volume. It carried certainty. And certainty travels further than noise ever could. For a brief second no one moved. No one laughed. No one interrupted. Because something in the tone made it clear. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't anger either. It was control. The kind that doesn't need permission. The leader let out a short breath, trying to shake off the feeling creeping in. "You giving orders now?" he said, attempting to sound amused. But the edge in his voice betrayed him. He wasn't as comfortable anymore. Steven didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the moment settle. Let the weight of what had already shifted sink in. Then calmly, "You've said enough," he replied. No threats. No raised voice. But every word landed. Because it wasn't about what he said. It was about how little he needed to say. The group shifted slightly, almost in sync. Not forward. Not backward. Just uncertain. And uncertainty in a group that relies on confidence is dangerous. One of the bikers looked at the woman again, then back at the leader, as if reconsidering the situation entirely. Another crossed his arms, no longer laughing. The energy had changed. Completely. Moments ago they were in control of the space. Now, they were reacting to it. The leader took another step forward, but slower this time. Measured. Careful. As if testing something invisible. "You think you can just walk in here and change things?" he asked. Steven met his gaze. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. "I didn't come to change anything," he said. A brief pause. "You already did." That landed deeper than expected. Because it shifted responsibility. It wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about consequences. The leader's jaw tightened. He glanced around just for a second, checking his group. And what he saw didn't help. No one looked as confident as before. No one was laughing now. The noise was gone. And without noise, their confidence had nothing to hide behind. Steven took another small step. Closing the distance, but not aggressively. Just enough to make the moment real. To remove any illusion that this was still just a game. "You don't need to prove anything here," he continued calmly. The words weren't directed at just one person. They were for all of them. And that's what made them effective. Because when a group starts thinking individually, it stops acting as a group. One biker shifted back slightly. Another looked down briefly. Small reactions. But meaningful. The leader noticed. Of course he did. And now the pressure was on him. Not from Steven. But from his own group. Because leadership built on dominance starts to collapse when doubt appears. "You're talking a lot for someone alone," the leader said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Steven shook his head slightly. "I'm not alone," he replied. That caught them off guard. A brief pause followed. Confusion flickered across a few faces. Because there was no one else there. No backup. No support. Just him. But that wasn't what he meant. And they felt it. Because being not alone isn't always about people. It's about control. Discipline. Awareness. Things they didn't have in that moment. And suddenly, being seven didn't feel like an advantage anymore. The wind passed through once again, quieter now. As if even it had settled. The leader took a slow step back. Almost unnoticeable. But it happened. And once that line was crossed, everything changed. Because the moment a dominant presence retreats, even slightly, the balance shifts completely. Steven didn't follow. Didn't push. Didn't escalate. He didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. Without force. Without chaos. Without a single aggressive move. Just presence. Just control. Just clarity. And that was enough. Backhand index pointing right. Why does true power become visible? Only when it stays calm. The tension didn't disappear. It transformed. What once felt chaotic, now felt heavy. Measured. Real. Steven Seagal stood grounded, completely at ease, as if the situation had already resolved in his mind. But for the bikers, it was just beginning. Because when noise fades, people are left alone with their thoughts. And thoughts are harder to control than any situation. The leader exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. His confidence hadn't vanished completely, but it had cracks now. Visible ones. "You think you've made a point?" he said, his voice lower than before. Not as sharp. Not as certain. Steven didn't react to the tone. Didn't match it. Didn't challenge it. Instead, he answered in the same calm, even voice he had maintained from the start. "I didn't come here to make a point," he said. A brief pause followed. "I came here to leave without a problem." That landed differently. Because it wasn't confrontational. It wasn't dominant. It was simple. And simplicity removes excuses. The leader shifted his stance, glancing briefly at the others. They weren't reacting the same way anymore. No laughter. No encouragement. No reinforcement. Just silence. And silence doesn't support ego. It exposes it. You're acting like you're above this, the leader said, attempting to regain some ground. Steven shook his head slightly. No, he replied. I'm acting like this doesn't need to go further. That distinction mattered. Because it reframed everything. This wasn't about winning. It wasn't about proving strength. It was about preventing escalation. And that's something people don't expect. Especially in moments built on tension. One of the bikers looked down at the ground, dragging his boot lightly across the dust. Another rubbed his hands together, glancing between the leader and Steven. They were no longer aligned. And when a group loses alignment, it loses power. You said there's 7 of us, Steven continued calmly, acknowledging the earlier statement. The leader gave a slight nod, though it lacked conviction now. Yeah. Steven met his eyes. I know. A small pause. Numbers can create pressure, he added. But they don't create control. That sentence settled heavily into the space between them. Because it challenged the very thing they had been relying on. Not directly. Not aggressively. But clearly. The leader let out a short breath, almost a quiet laugh. But there was no humor in it. You talk like you've seen this before, he said. Steven's expression didn't change. I have. No elaboration. No story. Just certainty. And sometimes, certainty says more than explanation ever could. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying the quiet with it instead of breaking it. The woman who had stepped back earlier watched closely now. Not afraid. Not panicked. But aware. Because the situation had shifted in a way she hadn't expected. No shouting. No chaos. Just control. And that control was influencing everything. You could have reacted differently, one of the bikers said suddenly, his voice quieter than the others had been. It wasn't a challenge. It was a realization. Steven turned his head slightly toward him. I could have, he said. Another pause. But that wouldn't have helped anyone. That line changed something. Because it introduced a perspective they hadn't considered. Not dominance. Not victory. But outcome. What actually happens after the moment. You think this helps? The leader asked, though now the question felt less like resistance, and more like curiosity. Steven nodded once. It already has. The group went quiet again. Not forced. Not tense. Just thoughtful. Because deep down they understood what he meant. Nothing had escalated. No one had been hurt. But something had shifted. Inside them. The kind of shift that doesn't fade quickly. You could have embarrassed us, one of them muttered under his breath. Steven heard it. Of course he did. But he didn't react with pride. Didn't use it as leverage. Instead, I didn't need to, he replied calmly. That was the difference. Because needing to prove something, and choosing not to, are 2 completely different forms of strength. The leader looked at him for a long moment. Longer than before. Not with arrogance. Not with aggression. But with something closer to understanding. You're saying we were wrong, he said. Steven shook his head again. I'm saying you had a choice. That reframed everything once more. Because being wrong creates defensiveness. But having a choice creates reflection. And reflection leads to change. Whether immediate or not. No one spoke for a few seconds. The desert seemed quieter than before. Not empty. But settled. As if the storm had passed without ever fully forming. The leader finally stepped back fully this time. Not slightly. Not subtly. But clearly. And no one followed him forward. Because there was nowhere left to go. You're different, he said almost to himself. Steven didn't respond to that. Because he didn't need to. The situation had already answered the question. This was never about being stronger. Or louder. Or more intimidating. It was about understanding something they didn't. That real strength doesn't rush. Doesn't react. Doesn't prove itself. It simply exists. And when it's present, everything else adjusts around it. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think strength is about proving yourself, or controlling yourself? The moment had already shifted. Now it was about what came next. Not escalation. Not confrontation. A decision. Steven Seagal stood still for a second longer, as if giving the silence time to settle completely. No one spoke. No one laughed. Even the wind felt quieter now, like it had nothing left to interrupt. The leader looked around briefly, then back at Steven. Whatever control he thought he had earlier was gone. Not taken. Not forced away. Just dissolved. Because control built on pressure doesn't last when the pressure disappears. And Steven had removed it without doing anything aggressive. That was the part they couldn't fully process. He didn't step forward again. Didn't push the moment further. Instead, He stepped back, slowly, deliberately, not retreating, resetting. That single movement carried a message just as strong as everything before it. This ends here. No announcement, no demand, just a decision. The bikers watched closely, because now they were the ones reacting, waiting, trying to understand what would happen next. Steven turned slightly toward his motorcycle. It had been nudged earlier, shifted just enough to look out of place. Without urgency, he reached for it. His grip was firm, controlled. He lifted it back into position with ease, not as a display of strength but as a simple action, done without effort. But they noticed. Of course they did. Because when someone does something difficult, and makes it look easy, it changes perception. One of the bikers glanced at the others, then back at Steven. No one commented. No one joked. Because this wasn't the same situation anymore. This wasn't something to laugh at. Steven adjusted the handle slightly, aligning the bike perfectly. Small detail, but intentional. Everything he did had intention. That was the difference. "You're just going to leave?" the leader asked. The question wasn't mocking this time. It carried something else. Curiosity. Maybe even respect. Steven paused for a brief moment before answering. "I was always going to leave," he said calmly. A short silence followed. "But how this ended was up to you." That line settled deeper than anything else he had said. Because it placed responsibility exactly where it belonged. Not on him. On them. The leader nodded slowly. Not in agreement, but in understanding. Because now he could see it clearly. This situation could have gone differently. Very differently. But it didn't. And that wasn't luck. That was choice. One of the bikers exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Didn't expect that," he muttered. Steven didn't respond. He didn't need acknowledgement. Didn't need validation. Because his actions weren't for approval. They were simply aligned with who he was. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his gloves slightly tighter, adjusting them once more. The same calm habit. The same controlled motion. Start to finish, nothing had changed about him. And that consistency was what made everything else change. The woman who had been at the center of it all stood a little straighter now. Still quiet. But no longer uncertain. Because the situation had resolved without chaos. Without fear. Without things going further than they needed to. Steven gave a slight glance in her direction. Not dramatic. Not attention-seeking. Just a brief acknowledgement. A silent reassurance. Then his focus returned to the moment at hand. The bikers had stepped back slightly. Not instructed. Not forced. But naturally. Because something in the space no longer allowed them to stand as they had before. The leader looked at his group again. This time there was no need to assert anything. No need to prove authority. Because the moment had already taught what it needed to teach. He stepped aside. Not dramatically. Not reluctantly. Just enough to clear the space. And that was it. The final shift. Because making space is a form of respect. Steven nodded once. A small gesture. But meaningful. He swung his leg over the motorcycle and settled into position. Every movement smooth. Unrushed. Controlled. He didn't look back immediately. Didn't scan for reactions. Didn't check if anyone was watching. Because he already knew they were. He turned the key. The engine came to life with a low, steady sound. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just present. The kind of sound that doesn't demand attention. But holds it anyway. For a moment, no one moved. The bikers stood there watching. Not as a group asserting dominance anymore. But as individuals processing what had just happened. Because they had come in loud. Confident. Certain. And now, they were quiet. Reflective. Changed even if only slightly. Steven adjusted his grip on the handlebars. Ready. Then finally, he looked up. Not at one person, but across all of them. A final glance. Not to intimidate. Not to challenge. But to confirm. The moment was over. And everyone understood it. He gave a slight nod. Then eased the throttle. The bike rolled forward smoothly, cutting through the space that had once been blocked. No resistance. No words. Just movement. As he passed them, no one stepped in. No one spoke. Because there was nothing left to say. The lesson had already been delivered. Without force. Without conflict. Without anyone needing to lose. And as the distance between them grew, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence from before. This one carried meaning. Understanding. And something else. Respect. The desert was quiet again. Not empty. Not lifeless. But quiet in a way that carried weight. The kind of silence that feels different after something meaningful has happened, even if nothing violent occurred. Steven Seagal had ridden off slowly, the soft rumble of his motorcycle fading into the distance, leaving behind dust swirling in the warm air. The bikers remained, scattered near the gas station pumps, each one caught somewhere between disbelief and reflection. No one had been harmed. No fists thrown, no tires screeching in panic, no raised voices beyond necessary words. And yet, everything had changed. The leader, who had started with a smirk and a swagger that could fill the entire desert, now stood still, glancing at the remaining members of his group. His usual confidence, built on numbers and intimidation, had cracked. There was a hesitation in his movement, a subtle but undeniable shift in posture. Even the wind seemed to pass over them differently, softer, as if acknowledging that the balance of power had moved, and moved without force. The bikers exchanged quiet glances. For the first time, they were silent in the presence of someone who didn't need to assert dominance with words or weapons. They weren't reacting to action anymore. They were responding to presence, awareness, and control, qualities they had not expected to encounter. "You could have humiliated us," one whispered, almost to himself, shaking his head. Steven, calm as ever, had left them to their thoughts. He hadn't needed to humiliate, threaten, or strike. The lesson had been delivered without escalation. That was the kind of strength that leaves a lasting mark. One that doesn't fade because it wasn't fueled by anger, aggression, or reaction. It was strength in its purest form, composed, disciplined, and unshakable. Even the woman, who had been shoved earlier, now felt a strange sense of relief. No one had risen in anger. No one had panicked. And yet the power in the situation had shifted entirely. What had looked like vulnerability in the moment of being disrespected was countered by the quiet presence of someone who understood the weight of responsibility, of restraint, of measured action. This was not a story about domination. This was a story about awareness. About choosing when to act and when to allow the weight of your presence to speak. About understanding that real strength isn't in responding to every challenge, but in discerning which challenges truly matter. The leader finally exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't even try to fight us, he muttered to himself. No, he hadn't. And that was the point. Strength isn't always shown with fists or fear. It's shown with discipline, with clarity, with the quiet understanding that some battles are best won before they even begin. And in that understanding lies true power. Each biker now stood a little differently. Shoulders less rigid. Heads lifted, but in reflection rather than arrogance. They were left to confront something they rarely experienced. The consequences of their own actions without anyone forcing them to realize it. Steven's motorcycle had disappeared into the distance, but his presence lingered. Not like a ghost, but like an example. A demonstration of control that didn't need validation, that didn't demand recognition but still commanded respect. The desert returned to its calm rhythm. The engines of other vehicles in the distance, the occasional chirp of a bird, these normal sounds seemed almost louder now because the intensity of the moment had passed. But the lesson remained. Respect is earned through awareness, calm, and self-discipline, not through numbers or aggression. Even the smallest details mattered. The adjustment of his gloves, the measured steps, the eye contact that communicated more than words ever could. All of it was part of a larger message. Strength that doesn't escalate can influence more than brute force ever will. As he disappeared over the horizon, the bikers finally started to disperse. Some shook their heads, some muttered to themselves, but all carried the silent acknowledgement that they had faced someone unlike anyone they had encountered before. Someone who taught them a lesson without a single act of violence. A lesson about patience, discipline, and the power of calm. And somewhere in the quiet desert, the woman took a deep breath, realizing she had been protected in a way she hadn't expected. Not by confrontation, not by chaos, but by someone whose control transcended physicality. It was a rare moment, one that won't be repeated often. Because discipline, awareness, and restraint aren't common traits. They aren't flashy, they don't make headlines, but they leave a mark far longer than temporary fear or anger ever could. This encounter wasn't about winning or losing. It was about demonstrating consequences. About showing that arrogance, recklessness, and overconfidence crumble in the face of awareness and preparation. That real power is quiet. Real strength is controlled. And respect is never demanded. It is earned. So ask yourself, backhand index pointing right, could you stay calm when others provoke you? Backhand index pointing right, could you influence a situation without raising your voice or showing aggression? Backhand index pointing right, would you have walked away as he did, leaving a lesson behind that no one could ignore? Speech balloon, comment below with your answer. Thumbs up like if you value control over chaos. Repeat button, share with someone who underestimates quiet strength. The desert remained still. The lesson remained longer. And somewhere far ahead, Steven Seagal rode on, calm, composed, and completely aware of the power he carried, not in his fists but in himself. Because true power doesn't shout. True strength doesn't prove itself. And the most important lessons are often learned in silence.